Welcome, everyone. I think we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Holly Fernandez-Lynch. I'm the Executive Director of the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics. It's my pleasure to welcome you today for a panel discussion about assessing the viability of FDA's biosimilars pathway. I'll take a few moments to introduce our panelists. Then we'll hear from Don Ware with some background information before we jump right into the panel discussion. So first, we're pleased to welcome Don Ware, who earned his JD from this law school in 1974. Don is the chair of Foley Hoag's Intellectual Property Department and past member of the firm's executive committee. He represents leading biopharmaceutical manufacturers, information technology companies, and universities in patent and investorship disputes, technology transfer issues, and intellectual property strategy. He also advises clients on FDA matters, including the FDA's regulatory pathway for approval of biosimilars, the topic of today's discussion. From 2006 to 2010, Don represented a coalition of biotech companies and research universities in negotiating the IP provisions of the Biologics Price, Competition, and Innovation Act in the House and Senate. Don's patent litigation experience involves a wide range of technologies. In the field of life sciences, he has successfully litigated major cases involving recombinant DNA, monoclonal antibodies, siRNAs, or is it siRNAs? I'm not sure. siRNAs. Small interferon RNAs, small molecule compounds, drug delivery, molecular diagnostics, research tool patents, and medical devices. In addition to Don's trial practice, he has extensive experience in appellate litigation, including appearances before the U.S. Supreme Court, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, and many other state and federal courts. Next on the panel, we'll be joined by Konstantinos Andrikopoulos, who received his PhD in biomedical sciences from the City University of New York at Mount Sinai School of Medicine's Graduate School of Biological Sciences, as well as his law degree from Suffolk University Law School. He is a registered patent attorney, currently serving as the lead IP counsel for Biogen's pharmaceutical operations and technology development, and responsible for Biogen's IP strategy on its biologic platform technologies. These platform technologies are used in the manufacture of Biogen's innovative biologic products. Konstantinos also serves as the lead IP counsel representing Biogen's interest in Samsung Bioepis, a joint venture between Biogen and Samsung Biologics, formed in early 2012 to pursue the development of high-quality biosimilar products. Konstantinos has provided advice to both small and large biotechnology companies and clients for almost 20 years, and brings a unique perspective on IP strategies protecting innovator products, as well as strategies aimed to reduce IP risks associated with the launch of biosimilars. Next, we have Nicholson Price, who is currently assistant professor of law at the University of New Hampshire, and in the fall of 2016 will take up a position as assistant professor of law at the University of Michigan. Nicholson holds an AB from Harvard and a JD and PhD in biological sciences from Columbia. He was an academic fellow at the Petrie-Flom Center from 2013 to 2015, so we're very pleased to have him back in our midst. He previously clerked for the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit and was a visiting consortium scholar at the Hastings Consortium on Law, Science, and Health Policy. Last but certainly not least, we have Rachel Sachs, who will be moderating this session. Rachel is currently an academic fellow at the Petrie-Flom Center, and this fall will take up a position as assistant professor at the Washington University in St. Louis. She earned her JD from this law school in 2013 and her Master's of Public Health from the School of Public Health, during which she interned at the U.S. Department for Health and Human Services. After law school, Rachel clerked for the Honorable Richard Posner of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit. And with that, I will turn things over to Don.
Clicker here? Okay, well, good afternoon. It's really fun for me to be back here. I had my very first class at Harvard Law School in the Pound Building with Phil Arita in contracts, and I remember he had a big seat plan where he had photos of all of us wherever we sat, and then he'd call on whoever looked the least prepared and it was quite an exciting time. So our concept really is that we, as a group, want to really kind of engage in discussion, and we're going to kind of let Rachel grill us a little bit. But we thought it'd be good to have make sure everybody had a little bit of background here so that we had a more meaningful discussion. And I don't really have a good sense, and so I'm going to ask you, before you saw the flyer for this luncheon conference, how many people actually had heard of the biosimilars pathway? Okay, so, but a lot of you haven't, so it's good. We're going to have some introduction. What about the whole Hatch-Waxman regime for generics? Do you all have some familiarity with that? Maybe, well, pretty similar. Because this legislation came many, many years after the Hatch-Waxman legislation, which created a pathway to approve generic drugs, generic small molecule drugs, which are essentially copies of an innovator drug that's been on the market for some time and provides a very inexpensive alternative to the original innovator drug. But in the small molecule regime, it's very easy to do that. You're just making a chemical compound. You're synthesizing a chemical compound, so you can be pretty sure that it's going to be really the same molecule. And indeed, under Hatch-Waxman, it has to be the same active ingredient as the approved branded drug. That was never possible, really, for biologics. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about biologics so you know what they are and why they're different and why there was no Hatch-Waxman type legislation, why they weren't included in it. So, as I say here, biologics are large, complex molecules. They're not synthetically made. They are usually proteins, such as antibodies or other proteins, and they are largely intended to be proteins that are actually found in your body, and so they're really replacing a protein that either is absent and causing a problem, or they're providing a protein like an antibody that can have some effect on the body, some positive therapeutic effect. And they are produced not in big vats of chemicals, but rather they're produced in living cells. And so biotechnology companies, when you hear about a biotechnology company, what they're doing is they're producing largely proteins, as I said, in living cells. So they have these giant bioreactors, and they create what's called a cell line, and they create cells that will just live on, and they will simply keep producing and excreting these proteins, which they can then be captured and used in a therapeutic way. One interesting thing, and one reason why they couldn't really be brought in under Hatch-Waxman, is that the molecules, what we call biologics, that are created in this process can be different in even if you have a molecule that is intended to be, for example, erythropoietin, even if you intend to create that, in different bioreactors and in different cell lines, you end up with a molecule that is a little bit different. And when proteins are processed through the body, actually, they often go through some changes where sugars are added to them, and they're added in different ways often. And so even within one manufacturer's process of biologics, if they have a facility in California and they have another facility in Boston, there may be subtle differences in the molecules. And certainly if another manufacturer decides that they want to create what we now call a biosimilar, which is intended to be very, very similar, it's very likely going to be different because it will be in a different cell, produced in a different cell line. And I like to liken it sometimes to making wine, for example. And so you can have a lot of different winemakers, and they can use some of the same grapes. They might even share a vineyard, but their wine comes out very differently because of just all the subtle little changes in the process that leads to the wine, or in this case, to the biologic. And in part because of that, they're very, very expensive. And so when you read about when you read about high drug prices and you read about something that's costing, $100,000 a year, it's very likely a biologic as opposed to a small molecule. Small molecule drugs are usually taken orally in pills, and generally you can't do that with biologics, and so you have to go to a hospital or a doctor's office, and the biologic is infused. So they're very expensive, and so there was a lot of interest in, could you have a less expensive version of this new innovative biologic drug. And eventually in Europe, a pathway was created in the European Union by the European Medicines Agency where they said, okay, well, we're going to start approving biosimilar drugs. And they got that off the ground in 2003. And so that's really what led and what kind of pushed the U.S. Congress into developing this pathway within the FDA to approve biosimilars. And the industry initially opposed it because their focus was really on safety and could you be sure that these different proteins that are produced in living cells and by a different company, could you be sure that they would give the same therapeutic effect? Would there have potentially be adverse events that would occur? And so there was a lot of concern initially, and within the FDA, a lot of hearings were held on safety. But they were doing it in Europe, and so it appeared that there would be ways to control it. And the FDA could require a lot of clinical data to show that the biosimilars would be safe and effective. The industry also raised concerns about patents and proprietary data and economics because one of the big concerns is that for an innovator biotech company to develop a biologic drug, they have to take it through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials. It's very, very expensive to do, and so there's a lot of data out there that it costs close to $1 billion to take a drug through clinical trials and get it approved by the FDA, and a lot of them fail at the very end and don't get approved. And so there's a very big cost associated with it. And in the small molecule space, in Hatch-Waxman, companies could rely pretty heavily on their patent protection, but that was believed that might be less true with respect to biosimilars because of the fact that the molecule would be different. And so if there were patents that covered the innovator's biologic, they might not cover the competitor's biosimilar. And so manufacturers were concerned that they would be left with an insufficient time to earn a return on their investment if there would be competitors coming into the market too quickly. Eventually, a lot of hearings were held, and the legislation was enacted in 2010. And so it approved a pathway for biological products that are biosimilar, that's a defined term, or interchangeable, also a defined term. And I'll give you just a little bit of background on this. So a biological product is distinguished from a drug, and for most purposes, what's most important to know is that this is now a way that FDA will regulate proteins, and that includes antibodies. And so it must be biosimilar, and then we have a definition here, biosimilar. And so the interesting thing about the biosimilar definition is it's a much more functional definition. It's not as distinguished from Hatch-Waxman, where you can take two chemically synthesized molecules and say these are the same molecule. In this case, the focus is not so much on whether the molecule, whether the molecular entity is really the same, but rather on the clinical outcomes of using or of administering the biologic. And so the definition in the legislation says there have to be no clinically meaningful differences between the biological product and the reference product, which is the term that's used for the original branded product, in terms of safety, purity, and potency. So that basically means safety and effectiveness of the drug. And another contrast from Hatch-Waxman is that in Hatch-Waxman, once you're able to show that you have the same chemical entity and that it is distributed in the blood in a very similar way, that's it. That's all you have to show. But the concept here was that you would likely have to show some clinical data. So you'd have to do some clinical trials with the biosimilar But a lot of discretion was given to the FDA to waive clinical trials, or probably not all clinical trials, but not to require the same degree of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials with a biosimilar. So a lot was left to the FDA, and we'll probably come back to that because it's one reason why it's taken so long, really, for anything to be approved, because it was not clear what the FDA would require. So manufacturers didn't really know exactly what kind of data package they had to submit. Then this legislation also defines interchangeable biosimilar, and this is what is most like a generic. This is what, if you were a generics type manufacturer and you wanted to go into this business, this is what you want to be able to end up with. This is sort of the gold standard for a biosimilar, because what's critical is that if you're a manufacturer of a biosimilar, you would like to be able to have the pharmacy substitute your biosimilar for the original innovator drug or biologic without the physician getting involved. And if you can't do that, if the physician's involved, there's, of course, the concern that physicians will just say, well, I don't know very much about this biosimilar, so I just want you to take the original drug. And, you know, it might be much more expensive and all, but, you know, it has greater certainty. It has all the clinical data behind it. So the test for interchangeability, though, was made very, very high. So it has to be not only biosimilar, which means no clinically meaningful differences, but this test also requires that you get the same clinical result in any given patient. And so that's it's radically different from the way drugs get approved, because in drugs, as you probably know, you look at large populations and you look at statistically meaningful data so that you see that it's effective in a statistically meaningful way in a large population of people. So if you've shown that, great, but here you have to go way beyond that, and you have to say that you're going to get the same result in any patient, and you know, it's kind of no matter what their profile may be, and that there is no risk in switching back and forth, so that you could have the biosimilar for 1 month and you could have the original product for another month, and you'd have no different outcomes. So nobody has figured out quite how to show that yet. It's really more of a scientific question than it is a legal question. And so it's vexing everybody, and so nobody has as yet applied for status as an interchangeable biosimilar. FDA will defend themselves as having worked very hard on this, and I can say from my own experience that FDA is very interested in being able to approve biosimilars. It's certainly a high priority of the Obama administration. And I also know that many of the congressional staff people who, when I was involved in negotiating the legislation, who were most involved in this and who are most committed to it, who really believed in it, then went to work for the FDA afterwards. And so they are committed to it. They have worked to put out guidances that would help answer questions about what kind of clinical data would you need, what kind of scientific proof would you need. They're still working on one that's supposed to come out this year on exactly how you prove interchangeability. But you can see there are lots and lots of biosimilar products out there that have been proposed and that are under development. There are lots of biosimilars that have been approved in Europe and in Asia. There haven't been so many here. There's one that was approved, and one, I guess the second one, I don't think it's been approved yet, but it's gotten the panel recommendation. So we're not so far along after, you know, we're into our 6th year after the legislation was enacted. But there have been a lot of meetings and a lot of work has been done on it. I'm just going to highlight a couple of issues. So what was the biggest issue in the legislative debate? So the biggest issue in the legislative debate was about the data exclusivity period, because the industry said, we can't be sure that our patents are going to govern a biosimilar, but we can't face a situation where we're going to spend $1 billion developing a biologic and have somebody else come in and say, okay, that looks great. Now that you've done that, here's our similar molecule, and we'd like to be approved as a biosimilar and enter the market and compete with you. And and normally you'd be able to keep them out because of your patent protection. But if you couldn't keep them out based on patent protection, the industry wanted to have a period where they could be assured that they would have exclusivity. So there was an exclusivity that was created that's an FDA exclusivity, not a patent exclusivity. And the statute provides that a biosimilar applicant can't submit a proposed application to approve a biosimilar until 4 years after the really the kind of the first launch of the reference product, and that the FDA can't approve that application in 12 years after the date when the reference product first came onto the market. So that period, the number of years, the 12 years, was what the industry proposed was, on the basis of economic data, was they set a reasonable period of time for them to be able to be assured that they could recover a reasonable return on investment on what it would take to get a biologic approved. But there was lots of debate about that. There were different economists who had different views about that. And the Obama administration favored 7 years rather than 12 years. I think the FTC came in with a paper where they proposed 0 years. So it was a big, big fight. And anyway, it came out as 12. But if you know anything about the TPP, which has to do with sort of the patent regime, et cetera, that other countries are adopting in the Pacific, that treaty has 7 years built into it. So that's what the Obama administration really wanted. And so there have been some discussions of coming back to that, but my guess is that it'll stay 12 years. And the fact is that a lot of the most successful, most profitable, largest selling biologics have already passed 12 years since they were on the market. So there's no shortage of very, very valuable biologics that biosimilar applicants can go after to compete with. Now, very quick commentary on patent enforcement, and this is how I got involved in it, because I'm an IP lawyer. I'm not so much of an FDA lawyer or government strategies lawyer. But this legislation created a completely unique mechanism for challenging patents. So it's very, very different from Hatch-Waxman. Hatch-Waxman is very simple. After 4 or 5 years, a generics company can come in and they can file what's called a paragraph 4 statement, and they can say that we think that your patent, you drug manufacturer, we think your patent is invalid, or we don't infringe it. That then triggers litigation, and those issues get resolved. There's a 30-month stay that happens while the litigation takes place, and during that time, you figure out whether or not the generics company can get on the market. The problem with that was that the only way you can implement that kind of a system was by listing all of the patents that are relevant to the branded manufacturer's product in one place, which is called the Orange Book. And so a generics company can look at the Orange Book and see which the listed patents are, and then they can say, okay, well, I think I don't infringe 2 of them, and the other 2 I think are invalid, and that's that. And then they can go forward with their challenge. But nobody wanted the Orange Book for biosimilars. And when I say nobody, I really mean the stakeholders. The generics companies didn't want it because they thought it was abused by manufacturers. They thought they listed too many patents that shouldn't have been listed, and it was too hard to challenge all of them. The biosimilars manufacturers didn't, the innovator biologic companies didn't want an Orange Book because one thing that would be different is that the patents that cover biologics are, of course, there are patents that cover the molecule itself, although many of those are now invalid as a result of the Supreme Court's decision in the Myriad case. But a lot of the patents that companies rely on for their biologics are actually manufacturing process patents. And so those processes are critical, really, to the molecule that comes out of these bioreactors. And for the most part, the companies didn't really want to have to identify what processes they're using because it's kind of a trade secret as well, their choice of processes. So they didn't want to do it, and the FDA didn't really want to have it anyway. So you had to create a mechanism by which patents would be identified that could be challenged, because there's still a sense, and Congress certainly had the sense, that a goal would be to work out any patent disputes well in advance of launching a biosimilar. So you weren't going to put a biosimilar on the market, then get sued for patent infringement, then have to take it off the market potentially, but rather provide the certainty to biosimilar manufacturers that they could get out of having a period of time when they could challenge patents. And so a whole complicated system was set up. I'm going to show you a graphic that shows it in a minute, that essentially requires the innovator company to identify their patents that they think could be asserted against the biosimilar. Biosimilar, in order to allow that to happen, has to give their confidential FDA application to the manufacturer. And then there's a whole process by which you work out early litigation and later litigation and how it all works. And it's all complicated by the fact that, at least in the original draft when I got involved, the Senate staff who were working on this, who were not part of the Judiciary Committee, which is one of the reasons this statute is very flawed, because it creates an entire regime having to do with patents, but nobody from the Judiciary Committee worked on this, actually. It was all the Health Committee. It was Senator Kennedy's Health Committee that worked on it. And so one thing they didn't realize, they created this whole mechanism by which a biosimilar applicant would then have to identify what patents they thought they wanted to sue on, or to litigate, to resolve. But the Senate staff left out any notice to the patent owners, because they didn't realize that a lot of the biotech patents are owned by universities like Harvard Medical School and MIT, or hospitals like Mass General or Dana-Farber. And then they license them to the biotech companies, because a lot of the fundamental biotech work gets done in universities. And so there had to be a mechanism created by which the actual patent owners would be allowed to participate in this process of challenging their patents. So I'll show you that in one second. And I just want to say one other thing about the process by which this legislation was enacted, which is the most unusual process I've ever been involved in. And that is to say, if you go back and look at this statute and you try to figure out what anything means in it, one of the things that you might think about is looking at legislative history. Well, there isn't really any legislative history of this very long, complex statute. And the reason for that is that's not how it worked. This legislation was actually negotiated by the stakeholders. And so you had the biotech companies and you had the generics companies making proposals, essentially, to Senator Kennedy's staff about what should be in it. And so I have my own file that has like tons of different drafts of all these provisions that were proposed by different people, but none of them was ever actually put into a bill that became a bill. You could say here was a version of the bill. These were all like staff proposals, and then the staff would write something and they'd send it out to people. And so then we, believe it or not, I mean, if you want to know how real legislation gets enacted, I actually spent a weekend in Washington where we had a great big conference room in I think it was in Senator Hatch's chambers, and so the generics company's lawyers were on one side, and I was on the other side with a couple other people, and we went, and the staff of Senator Kennedy's committee was sitting there, and they just listened while we debated all these things. And we threw out proposals, and then they'd say, okay, well, we need something to do something. And we'd all take a break, and we'd go out and write something by hand, and give it to them. And then they'd, massage it a little bit, and we'd have great debates and everything. It was pretty crazy, honestly. And so the result is that when you have big issues, and there's a big case decided last year by the Federal Circuit on the interpretation of this statute, and it doesn't rely on legislative history, because really there isn't any legislative history. And if you'll take it from a person who was there, they got it exactly wrong. They got it exactly backwards. But anyway, that's just my view. So, so what's created out of this whole thing is what everybody calls the patent dance, and it has to do. They call it a patent dance because there's this sort of back and forth It actually involves some negotiation between the biosimilar applicant and the the original reference product BLA holder. And so you can see it all on here, and I wouldn't, I'm not going to take your time to go through here, but it's a whole back and forth process that has to do with identifying patents, identifying more patents, then just negotiating how many patents will be litigated in phase 1, how many will be litigated in phase 2. And it's very, very intricate. A lot of time was spent in the Senate working out this thing and debating this thing. And after all of that, the Federal Circuit ruled last year that it wasn't really binding anyway, and it was just kind of optional. So it was a big waste of time, really. Okay, and with that, I will sit down.
Okay, so we're just going to take a quick second to rearrange a bit.
Yeah. So we have to go that way.
Yeah, so just move the chairs.
Of course it doesn't. Take our chair.
Rachel, I'm going to put you here.
Great.
Tight squeeze. Let's grab it.
Okay, I'm as far in the corner as I can be. Nicholson, we're going to go here.
I'm glad I'll just get a quote right at the door.
Why don't we have Rachel sit over here?
Okay, Rachel, what would you do here?
Yes.
That's yours. Oh no, this is your. I can do it.
Yeah.
So we'll put down
Still there? Yes.
Rachel, where are you sitting?
I'm sitting on this end, so this is going to be an add-on.
That's perfect.
Yeah, and we're back. So thank you all for joining us today. Quick announcement. This event is scheduled to go until 1:30. So for those of you who have class, we understand you might need to leave. But we will, after we have a little moderated discussion, we're going to open it up for questions. And there's a mic here that you all can line up behind. So John, we're so pleased to have you with us, and I have to say, I also had my very first class of 1L in this very room, contracts of Randy Kennedy, so memories of Pound Hall.
We didn't have electronics.
Arguably, we still don't. That's okay. So I wanted to start with the last thing you mentioned and talking a little bit about how we got the patent dance, how we got the BPCIA, and so most of the law students in the room will be familiar with the Supreme Court cases where we've litigated other parts of the Affordable Care Act and some of the language associated with those. But I want to talk about this case, Amgen v. Sandoz, that you mentioned before the Federal Circuit last year. And Sandoz has recently appealed it to the Supreme Court, so we'll see if they take it. I would bet they don't want to deal with it, but we'll see. And so I was wondering if between the panelists you could discuss some more of the elements of the patent dance and whether you think the outcome that the Federal Circuit reached is consistent with what the stakeholders, maybe not Congress, intended. You've already suggested. I'd love to hear more. And then I'd love to hear about how the procedures will impact companies going forward as well and how academics think about it. So who'd like to go first?
Well, I can just start off a little bit on the patent dance. So, and interestingly, a couple of preliminary comments. So this is part of the Affordable Care Act, and so if the Affordable Care Act is repealed, as all of the Republican contenders insist it will be, this will go down with it as well. So I don't think anyone actually thinks everything would be repealed. So another interesting thing about this is that this was not although it went through Senator Kennedy's committee, it was bipartisan legislation, unlike the rest of the Affordable Care Act. But this was bipartisan, and it was worked out by what they called the Gang of Four. And there were 2 Democrats, Senator Kennedy and Senator Clinton, actually, and 2 Republicans, Senator Hatch and Senator Enzi. And so everything about the Senate bill kind of went through them, and until ultimately it was done and it was presented to the rest of the Health Committee, or actually it's the, what is it, Health, Education, and whatever is Labor. Help, Education, Labor, and Pensions. But it was done by those 4, and so they actually, the big picture items were negotiated by them, and so they came to the agreement, for example, on the 12 years of data exclusivity. They were definitely not in the weeds on the patent dance. And the patent dance, it's just interesting to put it in almost in its historical context. This legislation was first being considered very shortly after the eBay case. Do you all know the eBay case? And so the eBay case, for the first time, suggested that in patent cases, a district court should have discretion whether or not to enter an injunction upon a finding of patent infringement. At that time, the generics companies were very excited by that because they felt like they might sometimes want to launch their product at risk if they could, which they can't really in the Hatch-Waxman Act because of the 30-month stay. So their notion was that they should be able to decide if they want to launch a product at risk. And they actually they were the source of this whole patent dance. And it was largely, from my perspective, from what was going on in 2006, intended to allow them to limit the number of patents that could be asserted against them initially. So there's a process in that crazy chart I had up there where the parties are supposed to negotiate the number of patents that will be litigated in a kind of a first wave of litigation and patent challenges. And it actually allows the generics company, or I call them generics companies because they were the ones who became biosimilars manufacturers at first. Later on, it turned out all the innovator companies wanted to be biosimilar manufacturers too. So, but anyway, they wanted to be able to limit it. And so the provision allows them to say there will only be 1 patent that will be litigated, that you can assert, you the BLA holder, reference product holder. And that's why, bringing this back to the Amgen versus Sandoz case, the big issue in that case was, in that case, Sandoz had said, had started off with the process that's set out there, and then decided that they didn't like it very much. So they, as I said in one slide in a presentation, they said, I don't want to dance. And so they refused to dance, and they said, go ahead, sue us. We're just not going to disclose our application. We're not going to disclose patents. Just sue us. And so the question was, is this whole complicated procedure optional or required? Because it has certain consequences. If you don't follow certain things, it means, for example, as the biosimilar, it means you can get sued right away. But so they said, okay, well, that's the remedy. Just sue us. And my perspective on it was that at the time, it was really, really important to the generics companies who were negotiating this to make this absolutely mandatory, because they wanted to control the number of patents that could be asserted against them, and they didn't want to give the biotech companies the ability to do anything other than go through this very tedious, long, drawn-out process, which almost certainly couldn't actually result in a final judgment of patent infringement affirmed on appeal within the time that you would need in order to get an injunction from the district court that could be enforced. And so it looked like kind of a gambit to try to set up a situation where they could actually launch at risk and get out on the market and then argue eBay and try to convince the district judge that for a whole lot of public health reasons and pricing reasons and all of that, it'd be a good thing to have the biosimilar on the market, even if it does infringe patents. So I am absolutely convinced that at the time the intention was that these procedures would be absolutely mandatory.
And to add to that, if you look at, I think Dawn has actually printed the whole bill, which is 40-plus pages. I mean, half of it is how that patent dance is to happen. That cannot be not a compulsory type of intent. Anyway, it has to be followed. And I think the word that they're all, according to the bill and the issue of the Amgen v. Sandoz is, according to the bill, it says that, upon acceptance of the biosimilar applicant's application to the FDA, you have a certain window, 20 days, I believe, where you shall provide your filing to the innovator so that the innovator can then come with a list of patents and figure out which ones you would be infringing or not. And it's that word shall. So is it a shall or is it a must provide? I believe that is at issue.
Yeah. So the thing that I love when I read this as a professor is you read this opinion, and it's just as somebody trying to figure out statutory interpretation, it's really fun because basically they've got the two issues. So they've got this one issue, which is it a shall or a must for the dance? And then there's another issue, which is, does shall mean must for essentially we get another 6 months of exclusivity at the end because you have to wait until you're approved before you can tell somebody, hey, I'm going to market it in 6 months. So there are two issues. Both of them, the question is, does shall mean must? Or does shall mean, maybe if you want to because we've got some other stuff over here that says if you don't do it, here's a slap on the wrist for you. And so you might think, well, it probably means the same thing in both of those instances. Either shall means must both times, or shall means may both times. And of the Federal Circuit, you got one judge that says it means must both times, and then another judge that says it means maybe both times. And the actual opinion says it means must the first time and maybe the second time. And what I think everybody at the panel agrees is that it should be the opposite. So it's just this fantastic thing where you're like, this is crazy. The statute as it's written is crazy, and the interpretation is really weird. So
It's all of
It
patent
would've-
law.
I luckily
Well,
don't have
it
to
would've-
actually work in the industry, so the fact that it's crazy I find fascinating and mildly troubling rather than, oh no, it costs my clients billions. But it's interesting anyway.
Well, it may get to the Supreme Court, and I was thinking it would have been a great case for Judge Scalia, though. He would have loved it because there's no legislative history. You don't have to worry about that at all.
So we will all be watching this case very closely, but for now, we are stuck with the FDA attempting to issue a whole series of guidances. As you mentioned, they've already issued 8, trying to guide companies along the way, but you also noted that they haven't yet issued guidance on a very important issue, which is interchangeability. And actually, at a recent congressional hearing, Dr. Janet Woodcock, the director of CEDAR, said that the FDA might approve a biosimilar as interchangeable even before issuing guidance on the subject. So I invite disagreement, therefore, on whether this is actually an important guidance for them to issue, but I would love to hear each of your thoughts on why the FDA hasn't yet managed to issue such a guidance, and when they do, what should we look for?
Why don't you start? Because I think it's a scientific question.
I can start. It is a scientific question, and I think maybe it is the prudent thing for the FDA to do is just to wait, mostly because as opposed to the traditional generic small molecules, where no clinical data is required to get it approved, a biosimilar will have to go through some sort of clinical investigation before they can get the approval. And I think even the short period of time that these clinical trials occur maybe not sufficient to decide whether the risk is low. Because in the FDA's mind, it's always the patient. It's always the subjects that get treated that have priority. And so I think what they're doing is just waiting to see, once a drug gets approved as a biosimilar, give it a little more time into the market with the patients to see if there are any adverse events occur, and then upon that history and experience, then maybe designate it as an interchangeable. I think that's how they do it, but I don't know.
Yeah, I think this is kind of emblematic of the way the FDA has approached this in a way that's quite different from, for instance, the way the European Medicines Agency has approached this, which is to say very much kind of case by case, let's take it meeting by meeting, one drug at a time. sort of analysis rather than saying, here's what everybody has to do, here are the clear guidelines, this is what we want, this is what you need to do. It's 59 individual products in an individual set of meetings about what's going on with your very specific drug. It's kind of artisanal policy making. And so I wouldn't be shocked if they ended up approving something as interchangeable without ever having a guidance. The challenge for this, of course, is that it makes it wildly hard to predict what's going to happen if you're at all an outsider trying to get into this market and find out what's going on, what is the agency going to do, what are your competitors doing. All of that stuff's much, much harder to figure out. And I get why they're doing it, which is to say, this is uncharted territory. We don't know. The science is hard. We don't have a lot of the basic science. But it makes for a really tough situation to predict.
So I have one other insight about that. I think that one thing we have seen is the FDA is very, very willing to meet individually with companies privately and talk about their proposed clinical data package and what would you need. And so I expect, because I know that companies want to have biosimilars approved as interchangeable, that they're having a lot of discussions with the FDA about what kind of data would they need to show that, and how would you design a trial to show that you can switch back and forth between the biosimilar and the reference product with no risk to the patient, no different outcome to the patient. Because that's not the way people have done clinical trials in the past. You've used, as I said before, a very large population. So I think there's probably a lot of interaction going on about what would those trials look like, how would you prove that, and then some companies are going to go out and try to do that, and then the FDA is going to sort of react to that data package and perhaps form their guidances in light of what they're seeing, in light of what they're being told by the scientists at companies, what they think they can do or what they can show.
And if I can add to what Dawn was saying is, let's not forget, even though, yes, there is precedent with the Europeans having experience with biosimilars, those drugs have been relatively simple. Very small protein parts. Now we're coming to an age where a lot of the big drugs, like the Enbrel, etanercept, are very, very complicated molecules. And a lot more ways that it can vary from the innovator product. And so I think nothing will beat experience, in the market with all of this before they can gain that interchangeability attribute to them.
So to keep on that theme, Europe has had a biosimilar pathway for over a decade, as you mentioned. Are there particular things they're doing well or maybe not so well that we can or should learn from here in the United States?
They have provided guidance on antibody biosimilars, I believe, as well, or at least they have been discussing these with the companies. Again, I think the FDA is approaching it the right way. Discuss it with the innovators and the biosimilar applicants. It's all about the science. I don't see it any other way of happening, and I think it is coordinated. I think that the people at FDA are capable and good scientists and have been, a lot of them in the private sector too. So I think the discussion is fruitful and useful.
Yeah, I don't have any particularly strong opinions on this. I don't know as much about the European situation as I should, frankly. I like the idea of predictability, but the science is so complex, and we're kind of trying to do this before we reach the level of understanding that we normally like to have before we do this sort of thing. And so given that, the one step at a time, very individually focused approach makes a lot of sense. The problem I have with that is that it's not particularly transparent. There are reasons for it not to be transparent, but I think it's going the way that it has to go, even if that's somewhat frustrating.
Well, I'm going to attempt to solicit some strong opinions then. Our faculty director at the Petrie-Flom Center, Glenn Cohen, likes to ask provocative questions. So I'm going to channel Glenn and say, is this going to work? So Europe's had a biosimilar pathway for over a decade, but they've only approved about 20 biosimilars for 8 different products. In the U.S., the first one that we approved has been approved in Europe for quite some time. Is the science just too hard right now? Do we have to wait a while before we're going to see any real progress?
It's not going to work.
Yes, thank
And
you.
the reason it's not going to work is not only because the science is too hard, but because the way the system's set up right now is in a lot of circumstances to keep the science too hard and to keep us from figuring stuff out.
Say more, say more. 'Cause
So-
Nicholson has written a lot about this, and his forthcoming article, Artisanal Policymaking.
Oh, that's a great idea.
You said
I'm
it.
totally going to write that. No, it's mine, I know, but thank you for so, I mean, I've written about this with Professor Artie Wright, who's down at Nuke, and the fact that these things are so process dependent and so kind of, they're artisanal products. This is how we make it, and the thing that we make is the result of how we make it, and that's basically as good as we get in characterizing it a lot of the time. It's wildly complicated. We don't know exactly how it works. We don't know exactly how we get to that final thing. We just do this the same time, and it's pretty much the same every time, and so go ahead and approve that. And if what you do is keep the way that you make it secret, as the manufacturers are very interested in doing it. I mean, even when they patent things, even when they patent manufacturing processes, they don't want to tell you which patented processes they're using, which patents cover their processes, because they don't even want that information out there. The whole point is, let's shroud our products in as much secrecy as we can so that it will be super duper hard for anybody to copy it. And the challenge with that is, if it's super duper hard for anybody to copy it and everything's secret, how do we ever get the science better and actually figure it out and not have to have this be an artisanal case by case, let's put it out in clinical trials or in the market for 6 years to watch and see if anybody dies, and let's understand this stuff. And I think there are very strong incentives for innovators to keep the situation as much in the dark as we can, because it's a sweet gig.
I respectfully disagree.
Yes, great.
I thought you might.
I respectfully disagree.
By the way, before Konstantinos speaks, it's important to know, and it was it was in his introduction, but so Biogen is a longtime innovator company, developed very, very important biotech drugs, but is also involved in a joint venture with Samsung in developing biosimilars. So like one of the things that he's evolved over the years actually is that some of the innovator companies who are most aggressive on all this, including Amgen particularly, have decided that they also want to be a biosimilars manufacturer, largely because they have the expertise and they have the manufacturing capacity to do it. And so I think that we're not seeing quite such a black and white, industry versus biosimilar perspective. And so I just say that before
Thank you, yeah.
Konstantinos speaks, because I think that a lot of companies like Biogen are actually trying to come to a fairly balanced view on this.
And I can thank you so much and that's a perfect introduction to what I was about to say, because it actually comes from a very recent presentation by our CEO on this last quarterly, an internal employee meeting that we had, and the message out of that, and I think all of us support it, is that we have to be socially responsible as a biotech company. We have to enable the healthcare system to be able to eventually provide support for more research, to get more innovator drugs out. It is our responsibility to try to help the healthcare system by using our expertise, right? And this is maybe the difference. I think the Amgens and the Biogens and the AbbVies out there, we are leaders in this field. We know how things work. We can make biosimilars work. We have done it, and we know what it takes to do it. It's going to be very unlike the generics kind of small molecule kind of field where you find these manufacturers from various places coming into this, because the investment they have to make is very, very small. Or at the beginning, with $5 million, you can prove bioequivalency in a petri dish or a test tube. In the investment in the biosimilar field is going to be multi-millions to get a biosimilar drug approved. It's not going to be easy, but we think we have the expertise, and we can put this expertise into place to help the healthcare systems of the U.S. and the rest of the world, afford these drugs that have had their, many years of exclusivity. And we know the same thing is going to happen to our drugs, to our Biogen innovative drugs. It is to be expected. And I think it's the socially responsible thing to do. So that's our view.
I can add one thing on it. I do think in terms of will it work and will it work longer term, there is there's been a lot of evolution in the science actually, and there is increasingly a view that you can rely on analytical data about the molecule that will be predictive of how it will perform. And so, interestingly enough, whereas for a new biologic, the FDA is very, very focused on very extensive clinical data, blinded studies, very large studies and all of that. But for biosimilars, in one of their guidances that you probably saw, they had a big triangle. They said, here's how we're going to focus on biosimilars. And they start at the bottom is kind of the most important part for them is actually starting with sort of analytical data. And only at the very top will you need, a little bit of clinical data. So I think that as the science evolves further, it will become easier to establish and more predictable that a biosimilar molecule will behave in a certain way that should allow it potentially even to be approved as interchangeable.
Yeah. So we've been talking about will it work from the perspective of being able to get drugs through the approval process, but one of the at least public-facing reasons behind the statute seem to be that there would be some amount of cost savings, right? We have small molecule generics, and they're much cheaper than innovator molecules. But in the biosimilar context, as you just mentioned, it's much more expensive to develop these products. And so what kinds of cost savings do you think we'll be looking at here, especially relative to that compromise, if any?
No, I think they will definitely be. I mean, that's the incentive, right?
Yeah.
Because you don't have to spend as much effort and money to get it approved as the innovator did. And so that savings on that front will definitely work down the line to how much you can charge payers for it. There are some examples in Europe, not by us, but of others that have developed other biosimilars because they have entered the markets. And in certain cases, they have gone to, which I think is an extreme, on almost like a 30% discount. 30%, actually a 70% discount to the innovator product. So I think that is an exception. I don't think you're going to see it, but I think as more and more of these biosimilar drugs get into the market, I think it will definitely push the prices down in the long term.
I think most people think very different pricing model than in the small molecule space. And when a generic enters the market, first of all, usually when a generic enters the market after its brief exclusivity period as a generic, you'll end up with 5 or 6 generics. So there's quite a lot of competition, and I think that the pricing comes down to about 15 or 20%. Would you say? Yeah. And at least in the testimony before Congress, when the economists were looking at this, what they were predicting, I think, for biosimilars was something that was more of a kind of 80% level of pricing. So, and so what that means is that the savings certainly will not be on the order that you would have predicted from a Hatch-Waxman small molecule, but still not insignificant, particularly when you're talking about big numbers. But it's equally important to remember that there are competitive innovator drugs that drive prices down. And so, the thing that you've probably all seen a lot in the news about the Gilead Sciences hepatitis C drug, which is, $100,000 or something like that. But, there is, AbbVie has an HCV drug, and I think there's about to be another entrant, and that seems to be driving the price down potentially quite significantly. And so my point is that there can be multiple innovator biologics directed to a particular target or pathway that can have as much or more impact than a biosimilar on bringing prices down.
Great. So before we get into the Q&A, I want to ask if there are any sort of final thoughts from anyone on the panel, a question I didn't ask that you would like to answer. and then we'll open it up. So if people want to start queuing up, you can, but I'll open it up to you guys just if there's any last thoughts.
Let's see.
I mean, I love your statement that the industry recognized that the socially responsible thing to do is to help drive innovation forward in this area. And, I totally agree that would be wonderful. And I think part of that is in investment in research, and part of that's in saying maybe, hey, we've got great patent protection, we've got great regulatory exclusivity. Maybe let's not rely on trade secrecy and trying to keep things secret. And if we want innovation, let's share information and innovate and use the explicit tools of patents and regulatory exclusivity and let that drive our profits. And once we shed light on this, everybody can be better off. But somehow I think you're not going to agree with that plan.
I actually have to, again, agree with that plan because we have put it in place and a lot of the other companies have done so. The good old days that this is, you make the drug with these all, secretive ways and nobody else can do it. It's not like Coca-Cola, right? So it's most of the innovation actually has come from us understanding very well our own processes. And technology has moved ahead. It is very different than what it was 10 years ago, for sure. And we now know, as Dawn explained earlier, biologic molecules are very complicated. They have all these sugars on top of them, and when you file for biosimilarity, you really have to match these things. We now know what causes the formation of these carbohydrates and how they should be. It's really, and sometimes it's serendipity that you discover these things from, right? So, and believe it or not, it's clearly, it's inherent to the cell line that makes it. That's one thing. But the second most important one is, what do you feed them with? And you find out that you change a little bit of the feeding, and lo and behold, you get a very different profile. But that, similarly, you can figure out how to manipulate it back to the original spec. So all of these things, and actually a lot of them have started to become public. You can go into the patent database and see under Biogen what has been published. So
All right.
I am...
He's going to do that.
Yeah.
I know he is.
But and just to underscore that,
Yeah.
because I've had some experience in this area as well, and so as Konstantinos says, one of the big important factors in getting a very robust production of antibodies out of a bioreactor has to do with the growth media, and it turns out that it really almost every company kind of tweaks that for their own product, for their own cell line. And if you're making these proteins in CHO cells, which are Chinese hamster ovary cells, which is the most common cell line used as a host cell in expression systems, you have kind of one set of growth media that work well. And if you have COS cells, for example, which are HEC cells or whatever, so sometimes they're human cells, they all feed differently. So people work, a lot of what the manufacturers are doing really is trying to get very, very efficient, high commercial level production. And so they play around with cell lines, they play around with the expression system, with trying to get multiple copies of the vector that you put in that has the DNA that encodes the protein. You play around with that. Then there are purification systems you play around with. And I found that every company kind of does it a little bit differently, and they find out what works for them. So in the end, there's also something to be said for some trade secret, some level of trade secret protection, because it actually forces other companies to innovate by experimenting themselves.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we have in the process too.
Yeah. I'm
Because
sure.
you have to
Yeah.
design around, right? So you
Exactly, yeah.
that's how patents are valuable in promoting science and being on the intention of our Constitution. So, which is fantastic to see.
So if people have questions, feel free to line up behind the mic and ask them. If not yet, I always have questions that I can ask.
I'm also, just in case anybody has any questions about this patent dance, let's put that up again because it's so bizarre.
I think we have changed
It's minimized.
the
Very
map.
esoteric.
Oh, okay. Okay.
There you go.
Can we
So that starts
turn that
to-
into,
there you go.
yeah, okay.
Question? Yes.
So there's a lot of talk on the presidential race about drugs and about the high cost of drugs, and I'm working with state Medicaid programs, trying to figure out what to do with their pharmaceutical budgets because it's grown, 30% this year. Do you think that the solution is in new legislation? Because I wouldn't be surprised if the next administration tried to do something. Or do you think this is a fix internally at the FDA where they just need to get their processes in line?
Go ahead.
All eyes on me. Look, and maybe I should go back to Dawn's example of Solvati and Gilead just because it's not Biogen. But don't forget, yes, it is expensive. It is actually a small molecule, but it cures, right? It cures the disease, which is an incredible feat. There's not that many therapies and diseases that can be cured by a drug. It's a unique example, and unfortunately, it was a bad drug to for Congress, I think, to pick on and go after. Maybe the Shkreli stuff is an easier target, right? But I think every little step and every little thing that happens, will help eventually the budgets. Maybe not short term, but I think long term we should be able to get it under control.
I'd add a couple of things. So for the most part, the drug pricing is not a situation where a company just decides to jack up the price because they think they can get away with it. Mr. Shkreli is sort of he's in a sort of a camp with a couple of others who the industry has been very scornful of them. One reason that the cost has gone up is that there has been an extraordinary amount of innovation in the biotech area. And so we now have biological drugs that can do things that, nobody could do before. And so they cost a lot of money, but they're also accomplishing a lot. I do think that obviously competition helps and sort of negotiation helps. And so one of the things that I've heard that would seem to me to have the best potential, relatively short-term impact is if you gave, if you gave the ability to agencies like CMS to negotiate drug prices, that could help. But they can't. Medicare can't negotiate, right? That's not permitted. So.
Although as
I have a lot of feelings.
Although as
Yeah.
Rachel has pointed out, that won't help. I can't remember why though.
Yeah, so the reason it won't help
It
is
sounded like it would. but-
So I've written about this and thought a lot about this, and ultimately there are some things the FDA or CMS can do, but Congress has to help them. So you can't. It's not enough to just say CMS has the authority to negotiate drug prices, because there are laws saying that Medicare and Medicaid have to cover certain classes of drugs. So, as any law student will know, if you can't get up and walk away from the table, your bargaining power is limited. So the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, scored the proposal just to give CMS the authority to negotiate Medicare drug prices. And they said that's not on its own going to save any money. You have to add something to it. Maybe what you have to add is the ability to set a formulary to say this drug is going to be paid for or not. Or what you have to add is, something like... there was a proposal a few years ago to require companies to enter into sort of binding arbitration about prices, like the baseball context, if they didn't want to negotiate. So different things like that. I often am a little stressed out with the way that Congress seems to be hauling the FDA before it and saying, FDA, why aren't you approving generic drugs faster? And then Janet Woodcock says, but there aren't any generic drugs applications that we have that would solve the Shkreli problem. It's not as if there's just a pile of them waiting for us. So one last point on this is that I think 50 congressmen recently sent a letter to the NIH and HHS saying, why don't you issue guidance on march-in rights? Under the Bayh-Dole Act, you have the authority to step in and grant licenses on patents that have resulted from federally funded research. And I wrote a blog post for Petrie-Flom Center's blog, Bill of Health, in which I say, look, there's a whole set of problems that this doesn't address. It doesn't get at the Shkreli situation where you don't have patents. There are often multiple patents, only some of which are held by universities. And Congress, you can't abdicate your responsibility to do something here.
No, that's a very good point. And just to add to that, you look at healthcare cost and expenditure, and unfortunately, for better or worse, drug pricing is the easy thing to look at. But when you look at what the healthcare cost is, the drug side of things is only about 12%. If you look at these many various studies out there, 12% of what the care is to the patient. There's other aspects on this that we should be looking closer as well and try to curb, as we go forward.
Yeah, but it's still 12% of a big number.
It is, but you know what?
It's not all the fat. I agree.
It is not. But not only that, who else reinvests back into? There's such unmet need out there. Who's going to address our Alzheimer's problem if you don't have, and large companies, biotech and pharmaceutical industry, invest a lot back into research. If this is how we want to do it, fine, cut the prices, then there won't be any innovation, and any answer to any of these big diseases and issues.
Yeah, I mean, I should also... I come across here like I dislike pharma, and I actually don't. I think that what you're saying is great, the innovation is absolutely key, although I will temper that immediately by saying that I disagree somewhat with your point, Don, which is that, I think there are certainly instances where drug companies set prices by saying, here's all the innovation, we have to recoup this is what's necessary for us to be able to reinvest in R&D. That's a thing. I think there are also quite a number of situations, not wildly well documented, but at least somewhat documented, and I find the documentation pretty convincing, where the question is, how do we set prices? And the answer is what the market will bear, or what do our competitors do? Why don't we do that? Or, I mean, you look at prices and they're set frequently at very, very round numbers and all sorts of things where you're like, I'm pretty sure this isn't just to recoup losses. This is, what can I charge? Now, I know there are many situations where that's not the case, but there are also a bunch of situations where it is the case, and kind of separating out those two things might be part of the problem, although I agree with you, that's not where most of the challenge is in healthcare spending.
And then the next order question is, of course, whether that's good or bad. And in some cases, we might think it's good. So it's a bit odd that Gilead has become, I think, a scapegoat here for their $1,000 a pill. Such a round number, right? This is a drug that, in my view, sort of shouldn't exist. It cures a disease that's prevalent largely among marginalized populations in the United States, and it's a true advance over the standard of care. Drugs like that don't come around very often.
Yeah, it's awesome.
It's really great, yeah, and it is priced accordingly. It's not the most expensive drug out there by any stretch of the imagination, and so it's, as someone who has long been part of these sort of more access community efforts to say, hey, look at the high prices of all of these drugs, the idea that this particular one would be our scapegoat, I understand why it is, but it's just kind of funny to me. Yes.
Could I ask, my name is Ed Burke. I used to serve in our state senate, and I was very interested to hear you began before and how the salami actually gets sliced. Is there an interchangeable category that is used in the European Medicines Agency, and has the EMA approved any product for this higher standard of similarity?
Right, that's a great question, and I don't really know the answer. Do you know?
I don't know either, but the interchangeability aspect of it, I think it's dealt with differently in Europe. It is done, I think, at the local pharmacy level, so the decision is left on the ground.
It's definitely country by country.
Yeah, it's a country by country, but mostly at a different level. It's not the AMA that
And secondly, in the patent dance, and it's terribly complicated, I don't really even begin to understand it, but haven't companies like Genzyme and Biogen did have a long run with their patents? They've gotten brand market exclusivity even long after the 20 years of the patents have expired. Nevertheless, the patent dance needs to be played. The application, the sharing of data, the exclusive use of data. aren't most of the patents that would be required to be shown by the innovator company have lapsed?
Well, lots of them have, of course.
Or in the
Well,
process
yeah.
patents, those are evolving and
But
there's
they,
evergreen
right, they
there
can,
and so forth.
right, they continue to evolve. So, you know, you can have, because of this lengthy time period of the data exclusivity, you can have situations where a biosimilar applicant might be faced with patents, but the patents might be expiring in 2 or 3 years, and so they sort of disappear. They're not that important. But, you know, most companies, and I represent a lot of these companies, are constantly looking for ways to, you know, further innovate with an existing drug so that they can maintain their patents that they can assert as well.
Right.
So, but generally not so much anymore on most of the patents that would actually cover the composition of matter, that would cover the molecular entity itself on most of the important biologic drugs, either have expired or are invalid under the Myriad case if they were patents that were, you know, claiming a gene that encoded a certain protein, which is the way most of them were written in the old days. But process patents continue to issue all the time, so they're still there.
And to add on this, to finish up, you know, most of the innovation happens really to protect, you know, the ability of the process to give high yields of good protein at the very end of it. You can make the protein, and I'm sure you can make it as a biosimilar protein, but can you make it in such high amounts that they make sense for you to enter this biosimilar field? It is very expensive, and this is where we have seen really only the big sophisticated companies like the Amgens and the Biogens and the Sandozes, you know, entering the field because it's just so expensive to produce. And a lot of knowledge and know-how and expertise that it's very hard to find out there. Yeah.
So there's one other field that FDA also regulates that doesn't have the Hatch-Waxman, but also where the similarity to existing product does, as I understand, play a role in approving the product. That's the field of medical devices. And I'm curious to see your views. Do you think that the process of approval for medical devices give us any lesson to the field of biosimilars, or do you think that's so too different, or is it equally an immature field for FDA?
Well, I think, so what you're referring to, what she's referring to is what's called a 510K application. And so a medical device manufacturer can get approval to put a medical device on the market by showing that it is equivalent of an existing one on the market. But, you know, the difference is, the reason for the different level of FDA involvement is that it doesn't, the medical devices are not, most of them are not intrusive, and they don't involve the same risk as administering a drug to somebody. So, you know, where they do, sometimes you have combination therapies that involve a medical device and a drug or a biologic, and then they actually do get regulated in the same way. They have to meet the same clinical data requirements as a drug or biologic. So I don't think there are any lessons to be learned for it. I think it's just a very different situation that really requires much less, because there's much less concern about safety.
I think that's right in many circumstances. I don't want to say that I think the 510K process is kind of a hunky-dory, straightforward thing because we're not worried about safety, because I think the 510K process is crazy in as much as you can say, here's a thing, that we've approved, here's a thing that looks a decent amount like that, and then you keep doing that until you get over there and you're like, what in the world is that thing? And it's nothing like this thing that we approved in the first place. It's wildly different, but you get there through this 510K chain. And so I think you get really bizarre results out of this, and that's problematic. I just didn't feel comfortable letting go without saying that, but I think the lessons are hard to apply because the situations actually end up being quite different.
I can always ask another question. So I'm curious about a theme that's come out a little bit in the conversation, which is about the changing industry landscape. So the players, when we think about small molecule drugs, historically we had innovator companies, and then we had generic companies, and there were a whole bunch of generic companies. And now it seems like the innovator companies and biologics are also in this biosimilar space, and there are fewer outside players. How does this change the environment, both in industry and for patent litigation? I'm curious, actually.
Well, I'll also give you a perspective as just being a practicing lawyer, since that's why you're all becoming lawyers. So you have to worry about conflicts of interest. When you do patent litigation, you're constantly, every time you get called by somebody, you've got to figure out whether you can, be adverse to the other party. And if you're a law firm like ours that does a lot of work in the life sciences, you have a lot of life sciences clients. And so I'm constantly tearing my hair out because, some great opportunity has passed by. And I'll tell you a funny story, actually. So I've been doing a lot of work in biosimilars and this whole space, and I chair a conference every year in New York that's about biosimilars. And so I felt like, it's getting myself known in this space, and also that I thought at that time it would be just like Hatch-Waxman, where you'd have lawyers and law firms would be on one side or the other, and you'd be on the industry, the innovator side, or you'd be on the generic side, and you really don't have conflicts then because you're just always, you're always the adverse party is in this other camp. And so I thought, this is going to be great because I've had, up until this point, I've mostly done biotech patent litigation over a long period of time, and so that was all innovator against innovator because there wasn't any concept of this. So I thought, and I got conflicts all the time. So I thought this would be great. And so finally the legislation gets passed, and I get a call from a company wanting me to advise them on all of the statute and everything and the patent dance and everything else. And it turned out to be a big pharma company, an innovator, big pharma company, very well-known company. And the company on the other side, the biotech company that was the reference product holder, was another client of ours. So I had to turn it down. And I have had multiple conflicts that have made it very difficult to represent companies in this space. But what we're seeing, I think, is a lot of consolidation. Even the generics companies, we've seen a lot of consolidation. It used to be lots of little companies, because as Konstantinos said, it was very cheap to launch a small molecule generic, a few $1 million or whatever. But a lot of those companies have been bought up by bigger companies, and so you have consolidation even in that space. And then you have the companies like Teva, who have also acquired innovator companies. And so now that, there are very few pure generics companies anymore. And then on the other side, on the biotech side, as we've talked about, a lot of the big biotech companies who aggressively asserted the industry position during the legislation have become biosimilar manufacturers, Amgen being the best case of that, where they've announced plans to launch 12 biosimilars, and really against all of the biggest selling biosimilar or innovator biotech drugs on the market. And so it has been very complicated for patent litigation, and we spent a lot of time trying to figure out if we can get waivers from clients so that we can sue them.
And it's been as complex on the in-house side, where you try to find attorneys that can represent you, and a lot of them, especially in Europe, are black and white. They either do innovator work and that's it, or they don't. But it's still hard because most of the innovator companies, have used, good, able counsel for a long time. So it's very tough to find
and so
representation.
if I can disclose this fact.
Okay.
So I represent Biogen on their innovator Biologics, and I have nothing to do with them on their biosimilars. So we'll just keep a little wall there.
That's because Bioepis is our joint venture partner has taken a big step at that.
Well, please join me in thanking our panelists. This has been a wonderful discussion.